Okay, my name is Martin Orbidans. I am a pianist on board the cruise ship, and I have been a musician since I was 7 years old. I'm now 55, and I have had quite an eventful life, working with working men's clubs in Yorkshire, all the way to the pinnacle, if you like, of working for the royal family. First of all, it started in 1981 on the Honeymoon cruise. In August we set sail from Portsmouth with a full contingency of yachtsmen. I'd never been a yachtsman. Funnily enough, actually, in my trunk as a child, my toy trunk, I found this photo album that said Royal Yacht Britannia on it. It was empty, no photographs, and I said to my mum, "What's this?" Oh, she said, one of your relatives years ago served as a cello player on the Royal Yacht Britannia." That was just an aside. So there'd been that connection in my mind from a child. We're talking about Beverley, East Yorkshire, absolutely nowhere near the Queen, nowhere near the Royal Yacht. Anyway, so there I am, embarking on the Royal Yacht. We did our safety training with our things, and then off we went, and we arrived in Gibraltar 2 days later, where Charles and Diana flew in, and I'm standing on the side of the ship in my full white uniform with my pith helmet on, watching Charles and Diana walk up. About 5 Rolls Royces pulled up in front of the red carpet, and up they came. And then, "Quick, Martin, get inside and play that piano," as they arrived. So I had to be playing the grand piano, and they walked through and caught my eye. Diana looked and said, "Thank you." Of course, that was the Royal Honeymoon, and later on in the cruise I was playing on the beach with the piano accordion, which Nigel Morton's book, I can't remember what it was called, The Story of Diana, has a story about me on page 26, wherever it says, "A Royal Marine musician was playing What Shall We Do with the Drunken Sailor, marching up and down in the surf." Diana had had too many Pims that day and asked me to go and have dinner with her, so I had dinner with her. Charles wasn't very happy. Another story. She said, "I've had too many Pims, I'm going back to the yacht," and she tripped herself up on the beach on the way back. Then she chucked a bucket of water over Charles as we got back to the ship. That was the Royal Honeymoon. Windsor Castle was Prince Edward's 21st birthday. Maynard Ferguson's band was there, and I had to sit and play, and the Queen came up to me and she said, "Thank you so much for playing for Edward." It was his 21st, and "How long have you been in the Royal Marines?" I said, 7 years, ma'am. "Oh, we've met before." I said, "Yes, on the Royal Yacht, ma'am." "Oh, I will remember." She said, "Well, I wonder what my boys are doing." She said, "There's terrible cutbacks this woman are doing." This, not talking about Margaret Thatcher, you know. She said, and she said, "Anyway, what can one do? One is only the Queen." And that was the Windsor Castle. Buckingham Palace, well, that was just a garden party where you played in the band. You never saw the Queen. But on several occasions on the Royal Yacht I met the Queen, and she was always very nice. In fact, I slapped Coca-Cola up her tights once.
I thought you were going to say something else.
Oh, it's hilarious. When she was having dinner and somebody gave me a can of Coke and they shook it up. I mean, it went off like a cracker. It went right under the table, splashed the back of her legs. Next day, she said to me, and the commander introduced her, she said, "This is your pianist, ma'am." "Oh, we are impressed," she said. Obviously meaning that the night before I'd had a bit of fun. Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, Royal Yacht Britannia. Yes, of course. And that's the fact. I mean, we were called up to go down to the Falklands with 12 hours notice. I had everything packed to go. And then they decided the Royal Yacht Britannia probably, I'm guessing here, would have been a target for the Argentinians. And I was petrified, and in the end they cancelled it, but with only a few hours to spare. So I was sat back in Portsmouth watching all my mates get shot at and killed. And of course, later on, at the Royal Marine Barracks in Deal, we did have the IRA bombing, where I had 11 friends killed. Yeah, Mark went in early that morning. Mark and I had been on holiday that year in the Lake District, and he'd gone in early to press his trousers. Now this is a funny thing, very English. The pressing machine was on top of the fridge, and the fridge was plugged into the wall, but there wasn't a two-way plug, so if you wanted to use the pressing machine, you took the plug out and then you plugged. This is what I've been told. The last thing anybody saw was Mark leaning on the sofa to lean over the fridge and put the plug in, and then there was the bang and the flash. You know, I understand that that was a very bad situation. I wouldn't want to say any more about it because it's tragic. But one of my mates was thrown into his locker, metal locker, which fell over and the roof came down, and he survived because he'd been protected by his metal locker. Everybody was scalped. Andy was apparently in the lavatory, and we don't want to say any more about that, but the roof came down and they tried to lift. They got the heavy lifting equipment, and he didn't survive. Timmy was another one. Half of him was in the roof, the other half under the floorboards. And so somehow you wish you'd been there to... Apparently I had an IRA woman in my kitchen a year before asking about the barracks, pretending to be a market researcher. And I'd been told by a mate in the Marines, please don't answer any questions. So I phoned the colonel, I phoned the police, and I left it at that. And about a year after the bombing, I had the special branch in my kitchen saying that you may have had Donna Maguire in your kitchen. But that's not something I would want to admit to, I don't know.
Okay.
It makes me feel cold. Well, it sounds very strange, but I was an evangelical church member, Christian, born again Christian, and I joined the Royal Marines, and because I felt quite isolated, I've joined a Baptist church, become a born again Christian, and over the many years that followed, I ended up in a church that sent me out to Egypt as a missionary, and I lived for 5 years as a missionary in Egypt. I was the organist at Cairo Cathedral. I played in the British Embassy, sorry about that, and I played in the American Embassy. I taught the ambassador's son the piano. I taught some CIA people's kids the piano, well, obviously all undercover. I had a Vespa motorcycle, and I drove all over Cairo playing in hotels, restaurants, Four Seasons, Marriott Hotel, Sharm el Sheikh. I know Cairo now like the back of my hand almost. It's my second home. So since then, I've been back again for 6 months prior to coming on the ships. I'd done 5 years cruising and decided I'd had enough. I went back to Cairo in the hope of finding a new life there. But unfortunately, the revolution took over and I found myself caught up in Tahrir Square in the middle of bullets flying and all sorts of things. And so I came back to Folkestone where I lived. I more than agree with it. It can become an institution. It can become, and for an ex-serviceman like myself who was institutionalised, where your breakfast is prepared and it's on the table, your bed is made, you have a structure of life, you obey certain orders and rules. The day goes by ever so easy. I play piano in the evening for 45 minutes, then perhaps another hour later on I'm able to have something to drink. I go to bed, I might go to the officers' bar and have a drink and meet my colleagues. I sleep until lunchtime and then I play melodies for sea at lunchtime, so the whole thing is very easy. I find it very, very hard to go ashore for a month after this, 2.5 months. I just don't know how people manage doing 7 months. I just don't know how they cope. And I think many people come back to the ships because it becomes their home. But as the guy on X Factor said, it can become a penitentiary at sea. No, it's not a form of escapism. I think for many people it is escapism.
It is escapism.
Simply, again, repeating what I said before, you don't have to do anything except go to work, which is actually sometimes only a minute away from your cabin. You go to work, you do your job, you don't have to drive, you don't have to worry about drink driving. To a degree, yes, we do get occasional the possibility of being tested for alcohol, but it doesn't happen very often. And especially as a pianist on board, I mean, I'm not likely to be in trouble for playing a piano under the affluence of alcohol. But I think at the end of the day, it is very much a difficult life and a form of escapism. But from what? What are we running from? Many people are running from trauma. Oh yes. My travelling years have caused devastation to my family. I mean, I'm divorced. I was married for 25 years. But because I was always serving music. And music isn't a career. It's not a job. Music is a vocation. Like a nurse. She may earn her living making people well. But she loves doing it. And that's a big difference for somebody perhaps who's doing a menial job that has no real, what you might call, you might view it as a very low-level job. Road sweeper. Exactly right. But there is a drawback to it because you lose touch with, well, what's real. Is it real living on a ship, or is it real living ashore? Is it real living on planet Earth? What's the alternative? You could say that we're isolated on planet Earth, couldn't you?
Yes.
And the word is isolation. From what, though? Very difficult. I mean, I have no home anymore. I've been able to support both my daughters through university by paying the rent on their apartments. My youngest is a nurse and my eldest is a doctor of bioscience. She's very, very, very good at her job and she travels all over the place doing lectures. And so, therefore, I think in a vicarious way I've been living my life to my kids, who are now more qualified than I'll ever be. Going to live ashore is something now that I think is something over the horizon. Something that I'm beginning to put off and put off and put off. I don't know the answer.
Okay.
It's like the legend of 1980, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you remember that film?
What, sorry?
The Legend of 1900.
I haven't
The
seen it.
piano player born on the ship. He was a baby on the SS Californian, and he grew up on the ship. Never went ashore in his whole life. He only got as far as the top of the gangway. Never went ashore. Only played piano on a cruise ship. And so when the ship came to be scrapped, they couldn't find him. He was hiding in a pipe in the engine room, and they blew the ship up and he sank with it. He died with it. Because he couldn't face life ashore. And the story basically is an extreme story about how you can become so at home on a cruise ship. And because you're a great piano player, obviously he was, there was no life for him ashore. And yet, some of the piano players ashore in New York came on board to challenge him, and he was still the best piano player. Some people have an illusion, and sometimes it isn't an illusion. Yes, sometimes the music and the performance on a cruise ship is terribly bad. But very often you find people who can play an instrument so well that the cruise line doesn't want to get rid of you, doesn't want to lose you, and you don't want to leave. And so you become so welcome that this becomes your new family. But you're never going to make close relationships on a cruise ship. You're always going to be in isolation. You're always going to live in a cabin on your own. And sometimes, to be honest, I've been ashore once in 3 weeks, and that was in Corfu. Southampton, blah blah blah, blah blah blah. Corfu, blah blah blah, blah blah blah. I tried to get off in Lisbon, but I just couldn't.
It's a lovely place.
Beautiful. I've been here 20 times, but I've never been off the ship. Well, you know what? You just don't believe the truth that one day you could possibly be a good musician. How did Oscar Peterson feel on his journey when one day he had to accept from his fellow musicians that he was brilliant, or a genius, or a legend? I've heard musicians say I'm a legend, but it's only black and white notes on a bit of wood. It's where you put your fingers, and I don't understand how I do it. If I could know that, I could sell it and teach it. Maybe I could. Maybe I would.
I think you could. And will.
Maybe I will. And when I go ashore next time, I shall be exploring life ashore. I shall be experimenting with the idea of putting roots down again. I practice when I'm on stage, when I'm working in front of the audience, end of story. There's no practice.
Right.
Except if a guest artist comes on board the ship and says, could you play one piece for me live on stage? Then I will practice it if necessary. I thought you were going to ask me if I could afford my own cruise line. I think I could afford a 10-foot barge. No, I haven't thought about that. I've often thought about setting up a music school. I did that in Cairo for a while. But in England, Britain, I think everything is business, business, business. The cost of running a business is higher than the money you would actually make. So I'd actually have to have help and get some fellow musicians around me and set up a music school. Yes, I did. What happened was that I knew I was adopted from a very early age. My father had been a displaced person. He'd served in the SS during the war, but not working literally in Germany. He was working for the Latvians against the Russians, and he came over. He couldn't go back home because Stalin was running his country.
Oh, yeah.
And so he ended up marrying my mother, and I was adopted. But I always knew I was adopted. Anyway, about 10, 15 years ago, I decided I would start looking. It turns out she'd been looking for me, but the law restricted her from finding me. I found her, we met, and we met. That was it. She told me that my grandmother was a concert pianist, my uncle was a cornet player in the Bridlington Albion Town Band, and my real father had a fleet of trawlers out of Bridlington. So a DNA.
A bit of a coincidence?
The sea, the cornet. I played the Royal Marines, I played the cornet, and I'm a pianist on board a ship. You've got the sea and everything. It's all in that.
Fate maybe?
Fate. I don't know. I'm not as religious as I used to be, and so I'm confused now a little bit between what is our DNA and what is faith and what is God. Because there's a kind of dichotomy there in my mind. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know one thing, that in my bloodline, in my DNA, is the sea, which came from my real father, the cornet, which came from my uncle, the piano, which came from my grandmother. Well, I could have been a fish gutter in Hull, but you know.
Hiya.
Hello.
What's next for Martin Orbidans?
What's next for Martin Orbidans is to carry on improving himself as a musician, being able to play in the context of life at sea, to always believing that being true to yourself and being the best musician for yourself will always result in a better performance for the audience. And if they're enjoying it, it's only because you're enjoying it. If you hate your job and you're looking at your watch every night, you're not gonna achieve anything. You've got to be true to yourself.
Thank you very much.
Be your true self. Unfortunately or fortunately, that has brought me to a life at sea. Momentarily, as Mrs. Bucket would say.